Okay, well, we'll get started. So I think all of you know that Pierce is my first PhD student, and I couldn't have wished for a better first student. He is brave, as any first student joining a new lab would have to be. And as a first student, Pierce gets to sort of set the lab culture. And I think he's done a really tremendous job. He always wants to do things better. He's not satisfied with just doing things the way he knows how. And so I think if we tracked Pierce's progress from the first year to now, there's just sort of a continuous improvement. You know, he came in not really knowing how to code, and now codes way better than I do, and anyone I think he communicates with here does. And so it speaks to his kind of continuous drive for getting better at things. And he's also been, as many of you can attest, I think tremendously generous with his time, helping other students, postdocs, with stats, with coding. So he's not satisfied with just doing things better for himself, but he wants to see others do better. So there are many different models for PhDs. Pierce's is not the kind of putting a bunch of projects together kind of PhD. Rather, it represents about a year and a half of his last year and a half or so of his work here. And so you won't get to hear about his earlier projects, most of which are published. I'll tell you about one of the projects you won't get to hear about, which is very cool and involved having people make judgments about what things look like and various also encyclopedic properties. For example, is an alligator green? Is an alligator a reptile? And the question was whether your visual knowledge, the knowledge of what things look like, is represented in a visual format. And the way that he addressed that is to see if visual interference, in the case of those experiments, simply having people view flashing patterns while answering these questions, selectively disrupted accuracy on judgments of appearance. So, and as the study showed, indeed, that was what was observed. People had a harder time telling that an alligator was green, or that dogs had a tail, these kinds of things, than that dogs were pets or alligators were reptiles, when people were viewing these irrelevant for the task flashing patterns. So this was a first behavioral demonstration that visual interference disrupted visual knowledge, showing that knowledge is at least partially represented in the visual form. But you're not going to hear about any of that. Instead, you'll hear about Pierce's recent work, which took a sharp turn, really, from the work that he was doing earlier and represents entirely independent research into cultural evolution. This is something that people have been interested in for centuries, but has only really in the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, has been subjected to experimental tests. There have been computational models for a few decades, but it's only now that people are starting to do experiments trying to understand what makes humans and human culture so different from that of other animals. Specifically, what enables cultural evolution in humans that progresses. We don't simply learn from our own experience, we don't simply learn from observing others, but we learn and then somehow improve on those experiences so that we don't have to start over with each generation. And so, because it's really new research, it's in the stage, the field is new, so Pierce presented some of the work last fall at the first ever Cultural Evolution Society meeting, for example. So this is a brand new field in terms of actually doing experiments. And it's stuff that's hard to do. The methods haven't been worked out. The variables that you're measuring have, there's no consensus on what needs to be measured. And so I think that Pierce took that sharp turn also speaks to his bravery as a scientist in venturing something into something new and something that I had various opinions about, but that I couldn't advise him about based on my own research experience. So that's what you'll hear about in this talk. And the format is going to be that Pierce will talk for about 45, 50 minutes. There'll be some questions from everyone, and then the committee will meet in room 211. And then there'll hopefully be some refreshments in room 519 afterwards.
All right. Thanks, Gary. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Like Gary said, this is relatively new work, given how I've been here. This is my 5th year now. But I'm really excited to finally be able to tell everybody about it. All right. How long does it take to run 400 meters? The world record holder is a man named Wade van Nijkerk from South Africa, who in 2016 ran 400 meters in 43.03 seconds. So this amounts to a bit under 11 seconds per 100 meters. But Usain Bolt can run 100 meters in 9.58 seconds. So a faster way to cover 400 meters would be to have Usain Bolt run 100 meters 4 times for a total of 38.32 seconds. But it turns out that the fastest way to run 400 meters is as a relay team. So in 2012, the Jamaican team, which included Bolt, ran 400 meters in 36.84 seconds. That's 6 seconds faster than Van Nijkerk and 1.5 seconds faster than 4 times Usain Bolt's best 100 meter. Why is a relay strategy effective for running races? Well, part of the reason is that each person has a shorter distance to run and is less likely to get fatigued. But in order to explain why a relay team can be faster than the fastest individual, we need an additional explanation. So in this case, the reason is that sprinters are at their slowest when accelerating and take between 30 and 50 meters to reach peak velocity. In a relay race, only one person has to accelerate from 0, and everybody else receives the baton while already in motion. So one reason that a relay strategy is effective for running races is that each person gets a head start on running. My research asks whether a relay strategy can be similarly effective for solving problems. So in this case, the baton is a tool or other solution to a problem that can be passed on or inherited by someone in the next generation. Now, it would seem that a relay strategy would be effective for problem solving because each person in the team wouldn't have to reinvent the same solutions over and over again. They should get some sort of head start on future problem solving. But how much of a head start do they get? Can a relay team ever outperform the best individual, as is the case for sprinters? Now, a more general form of this question is, how do we measure the impact of inheritance on problem solving? Now, this figure really summarizes my answer to that question. So from now on, I'm going to refer to a relay strategy for problem solving as diachronic collaboration. Now, that term, diachronic, is intended to emphasize that labor is being coordinated over generations, and it can be contrasted with synchronic collaboration, where labor is coordinated within the same generation. All right. So real-world teams involve both diachronic and synchronic elements, but the experiments I'm going to tell you about today were designed to tease apart the relative effectiveness of these different strategies for solving the same set of problems. Now, I was particularly interested in the performance of these individuals that were assigned to the second generation of the diachronic teams. So these people are the first ones to benefit from inheritance. Now, how do we measure the impact of inheritance on problem solving? My answer to that question is that we can compare the performance of these individuals to the performance of individuals solving the same problems in these other conditions. Now, you'll notice that the arrows for the synchronic team are shorter than the other arrows. Now, that indicates that in my experiments, I'm controlling for what can be generally referred to as labor hours. So here I'm showing you the relationship between labor hours and calendar hours. So in my experiments, I'm controlling for labor hours here. So you see that the arrows for the synchronic team are shorter because that strategy sort of spends their labor hours faster than the other strategies. The difference between the diachronic and isolated strategies is in terms of individual learning time. Okay, so an isolated strategy has the most time for individual learning. But as we'll see, there are some cases where spending all of the time in isolated learning is not the most effective strategy for solving problems. Okay, so make sure I get all my points here. I'm going to return for why it's important to control for labor hours in a second, but for right now, I just want to emphasize that when you control for labor hours, you can ask really interesting questions. So you can ask, what is the benefit of inheritance relative to the cost of creating it? Is it better to go it alone or pass on to somebody else? And is this the best use of our time? So these are the sorts of questions that you can do when you control for labor hours. So how might inheritance impact problem solving? Now, the mechanism that I'm proposing is that learning from someone else's solutions provides a unique learning environment compared to acquiring the same knowledge through individual trial and error learning. The best evidence of this is the idea that we can learn from others things that we cannot learn ourselves. So this idea goes by a number of different names in the literature. In education research, it's known as scaffolding, the idea that a teacher can help a student solve problems that they would not be able to otherwise. Chibra and Gerge have described our ability to effectively learn from others as a form of natural pedagogy. From a comparative perspective, Tenney, Call, and Tomasello describe what makes human problem solvers unique is our ability to inherit solutions from outside of what they call as our zone of latent solutions, which just means that we can use tools and other solutions to problems that we could not create on our own. And they argue that this is unique to humans. And a final example of this is the idea of apprentice learning. This is discussed by the philosopher Kim Sterelny. So he pulls on anthropological evidence that apprenticing is a really common way of passing complex tool-making skills on to next generations. And the idea is that with this apprentice learning model, the individuals can learn skills that they couldn't acquire otherwise. Now, in all of these cases, they generally involve people with knowledge or experts passing that knowledge on to novices. But in my experiments, by comparison to this relay team, I'm most interested in whether a team of equally skilled individuals could ever outperform the best individual. Now, in the group problem-solving literature, this is generally known as an assembly bonus effect. All right, assembly bonus effects, they're defined as situations where working together in a group raises the performance of the group more than any individual in the group could have accomplished on their own. So for example, if you're completing the Wason selection task, this is a logic puzzle that many people find counterintuitive. As an individual, only 9% of individuals get the correct answer, but if you allow people to solve the same task in groups of 5 or 6, that performance is raised to 70%. Assembly bonus effects are found most commonly in memory tasks. So in these experiments, you have a group of people, they watch some video, and then you test them on the details of the video later on. And you find that, in general, the memory of the group, if they're allowed to confer before making their decisions, is better than the memory of any individual. Now, these effects are controversial in the fact that they don't always reflect an improvement in individual performance. It could be an effect of aggregation rather than interaction. So in the memory case, groups remember more items, but each individual does not necessarily have a better memory. So so for example, a more general form of this idea is that groups may perform better than individuals, but it may be suboptimal. Okay, it's less than the sum of their parts. And what this means is that when we're talking about assembly bonus effects, we really need the proper control conditions. That's the way to distinguish between whether it's aggregation or interaction. Now, there is more general agreement that groups often perform differently than the individuals in them. So if you have a group of people completing a battery of cognitive tasks, the performance of the group is often better predicted by a collective intelligence factor that's specific to each group rather than the general intelligence factors of any of the group members. In another case, if you're having people perform this perceptual judgment task under uncertainty and you allow pairs of people to confer before making their decisions, you find that they're able to sort of optimally combine their uncertainty about the trial that they just saw, resulting in greater perceptual performance than even the best individual if they were to do it alone. Now, in this previous work, it's looked at assembly bonus effects in what I'm calling synchronic collaboration. But whether diachronic collaboration results in this unique form of problem solving is an open research question. So now I'm just going to talk about two hypotheses about where a relay strategy might be effective for problem solving. So the first is the idea that inheritance might remediate the cost of fixation. So fixation is defined as the intrusion of old and inappropriate solutions that prevents the generation of new and appropriate ones. So if individuals get sort of slowed down and bogged down by previous incorrect guesses, if they can pass on only the successful solutions to the next generation, it might be that as a team, they can perform better than an individual alone. The second hypothesis relates to the relative skills of each generation. So here, on the view that I'm proposing here, that what makes inheritance have an impact on problem solving is by providing a unique learning environment, we should expect that inheriting a solution from someone with very different skills than us should have a larger impact on future problem solving performance compared to inheriting from someone with similar skills. Now, in a problem solving or a group performance context, we know that diversity can have both positive and negative consequences. So on the positive side, diverse groups are better at integrating multiple perspectives, and for some types of problems, they might be better at maintaining a broader search for possible solutions. But diversity can have negative consequences as well, potentially promoting misunderstandings and conflict that sort of detract from group performance. So here I'm going to focus on the positive benefits of diversity, and I'm going to call this complementary inheritance. So complementary inheritance is the idea that individuals can inherit solutions that they could not create themselves, and as a result, the group might be able to arrive at solutions that neither individual would be able to on their own. So I'm going to return to those hypotheses in a second, but let me just take a step back and explain why I think understanding the effectiveness of a relay strategy is important. The reason is that this question relates to ongoing debates in human evolution about why humans are more effective problem solvers than other animals. If I had to simplify the debate somewhat, I would say that on one side, we have people say that we evolved specialized intelligences or modules. These are packets of advanced reasoning processes that improve individual problem-solving ability. On the other side, we have people who say that our success in problem solving is in large part due to our systems of cultural inheritance. So on this view, it's not necessarily our ability to solve problems as individuals that's all that impressive. Instead, it's our ability to copy others that makes humans adaptive problem solvers. So this view has been embraced by the ecologists Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, among other people. A favorite source of evidence for why cultures are more adaptive than individuals comes from what Rob Boyd has termed the lost European explorer experiments. Okay, so these are cases where otherwise intelligent and well-equipped individuals get stuck and stranded in a foreign land, and the test is whether they can survive off the land long enough to make it back home. Now, the irony of these experiments is that these explorers often die right alongside indigenous populations that have no problem surviving in the same environment. So one example of this is the Burke and Wills expedition across Australia. They were venturing across Australia, and they were running out of supplies. They ran into a group of Aborigines who had no problem surviving off the land. So the explorers saw that the Aborigines were eating a lot of this aquatic fern called nardoo, and they would mash it into this paste and form it into these seed cakes. And the explorers just saw that they were eating a lot of nardoo, so this must be the way that everybody survives in this land. It turns out that the food preparation process removed some critical toxins from nardoo. And the explorers did not follow this process for preparing the nardoo, and it led to thymine deficiency that led to their death. So here's a passage from Will's diary right before he dies, just describing how odd it is to die of starvation with a full belly. It says, "Starvation on nardoo is by no means unpleasant, but for the weakness one feels and the utter inability to move oneself. For as the appetite is concerned, it gives me the greatest satisfaction." So these lost European explorer experiments just demonstrate that in some cases, cultures seem to be able to solve problems that individuals plopped in the same environmental conditions cannot. So why is cultural inheritance adaptive? Why is it more beneficial to be able to copy the behaviors of somebody else than to be able to be a good problem solver all by yourself? Now, the argument articulated by Boyd and Richardson over the years is basically that cultural inheritance is adaptive because even smart people die. No matter how smart you are, there's only so much you can accomplish in a single lifetime. And if you cannot copy or inherit from other people, you're going to be limited to your own intelligence. But if you can copy, that enables problem solving to extend far longer than any individual lifetime. and eventually cultures can solve problems that individuals cannot. So this idea that cultural inheritance can accumulate over generations is often referred to as cumulative culture. So here's a good description of cumulative culture from Dean et al. They say, human cumulative culture combines high fidelity transmission of cultural knowledge with beneficial modifications to generate a ratcheting in technological complexity, leading to the development of traits far more complex than an individual could invent alone. So I'm hoping at this point you see this relationship between the process of cumulative culture and what I'm referring to as diachronic collaboration, or a relay strategy for problem solving. High fidelity transmission refers to a successful handoff of a baton from one generation to the next, and beneficial modifications refers to the idea that we're not just copying these behaviors, but we're extending them and improving them in some way. When people talk about cumulative culture, they often talk about it as being unique to our species. So let me just unpack that argument for a second. It used to be that one of the most common arguments given for what makes humans unique compared to other animals is that humans have culture and animals do not. So cultural inheritance is generally thought of as being made possible by social learning, which is what Thorndike called from an act witnessed, learn to do the act. Now for many years it was thought that animals can't do this, can't learn from others. So Thorndike describes these frustrating experiments to get cats, dogs, and chickens to learn from the observation of others. He would train some of them how to escape from an enclosure or gain access to some food, and then he would have them demonstrate that ability right in front of view of all the others, and none of them would ever pick up on it. And so he just thought social learning is not found widely in the animal kingdom. But it turns out that in the time since, we've documented a number of cases where animals appear capable not only of social learning, but also carrying on rudimentary forms of cultural traditions. So a famous example of this is there was a troop of macaque monkeys. There was one particular macaque monkey who the researchers named Emo. She was observed taking her sweet potatoes and washing the dirt and sand off of them in the stream prior to eating them. And the researchers watched as all of the other macaques over a period of years learned to adopt this exact behavior. So this is a rudimentary form of cultural inheritance. We also have seen evidence of cultural learning in a number of other animals, so chimpanzees, whales, birds, even insects like bees have been shown to be capable of learning from the observation of others or interaction with others. In contrast, cumulative culture has only been argued in a few specific cases. So one case is among New Caledonian crows, and another one among a particular population of chimpanzees. And I'm just going to talk about the crow case for example. New Caledonian crows are really great tool users. They create these skewers out of pandanus leaves, and they use those skewers to extract grubs from inside of trees. Now the researchers sort of documented variability in the way that these tools were designed, and they put together this argument that these more complicated multi-step tools could have only arisen through incremental adaptations of the simpler tools. Now other than this being a sort of exception that proves the rule, you can still debate whether this is true cumulative culture, because we don't have any measure of whether these more complicated tools are any better than the simpler tools. So you can put together this argument, but in order for it to be true cumulative culture, you need to have a marked improvement in some outcome. So in contrast, we've got a lot of evidence of cumulative culture in humans. The historian George Basala has described the history of human technology as a process of gradual refinement and repurposing rather than punctuated advances brought on by rare geniuses. So he argues that even in cases where we think that a particular inventor sort of came up with an idea all on their own, upon further inspection, it turns out that they were sort of adapting things that had already been around. So one example of this is the Gutenberg printing press was an adaptation of the screw press, which Romans used for creating olive oil and wine. Cumulative culture can also be seen within a particular technological domain. So the most famous example of this is Moore's law, which describes the exponential growth in the efficiency of computing chips. But really, Moore's law is just one example of what's generally known as a learning curve in manufacturing. You can see these in a whole number of domains. It's very regular, monotonic, and cumulative improvements in certain technological domains. Now, exponential growth was not known to our earliest ancestors. During the Acheulean period, we spent about 1 million years making tools that weren't much more complicated than this Acheulean hand axe. But even over this time, there was some evidence of cumulative improvement. So people have argued that over years, the Acheulean hand axes became more symmetrical. And they've even done field butchery tests where they have people take symmetrical hand axes versus asymmetrical hand axes, and they document that the symmetrical hand axes result in better yields of a carcass. So there's some evidence that maybe that wasn't adaptation, that it was a better tool. Okay, so given the importance of cumulative culture to human nature, it would seem really important to have good experimental models for understanding the conditions under which cumulative culture is likely to occur. There's basically been 2 distinct approaches to studying cumulative culture in the literature. One is to use what I've been referring to as a relay strategy, but it was generally known as a transmission chain experiment. So these experiments have a long history in psychology, tracing back to Frederick Charles Bartlett doing, he would have participants pass folk tales from one person to another, much like in the game of, children's game of telephone. And he just documented how the story sort of systematically changed. These experiments have also been used to study things like conformity and inductive biases and language evolution. But in the context of cumulative culture, they've been primarily used to demonstrate the capacity for cumulative culture and not necessarily its effectiveness. So an example of this, Christine Caldwell and Alice Millen had participants create paper airplanes and fly them as far as they could. And then the next participant would show up, they would observe what the previous person did, and then they would have to make their own paper airplane. And the finding was that, in general, if you observe someone making a paper airplane and flying it, chances are you might be able to make one that's just ever so slightly better. Okay, so showing this capacity for cumulative gains. But it doesn't actually talk about the effectiveness of this as a problem-solving strategy. So in those experiments, it does not compare the output of that transmission chain to a single individual given the same number of trials, given the same number of paper airplane folding attempts. The other approach to studying cumulative culture in the lab it uses what I'll call this social learning strategy. So in these experiments, you have a group of people that all working together on some task, and they vary the network structure. So the people that you're exposed to, which ones you're learning from, and they investigate things about population size. So an example of this is from Max Derricks and Rob Boyd. They had this experiment where people played this game to create tools that were used to build these digital totem poles, and they found that a group of social learners were able to perform better than an individual working alone. So on this camp, they've sort of looked at the effectiveness of groups compared to individuals, but they haven't really looked at the over-generation component of it. So the purpose of my experiments was to try to combine these 2 approaches, and I wanted to disentangle the effects of inheriting from somebody else at the start of a problem-solving task. So you're sort of born into this problem-solving knowledge compared to the effects of just working together in a group synchronically at the same time. So I'm going to talk about 3 separate experiments that address this. They all deal with some aspect of diachronic collaboration. The first experiment, I'm just going to investigate how effectively problem-solving performance accumulates over generations. In the second experiment, I'll compare the effectiveness of a diachronic strategy to alternative strategies for solving the same set of problems. In the final experiment, I'm going to focus on this idea of complementary inheritance. And that's the idea that individuals trained on independent and complementary skills might be able to outperform individuals working alone or individuals trained on the same skills in a sort of congruent way. Okay, so for the first experiments, I used the totems game that I talked about earlier from Derricks and Boyd, and this is what the game looked like. So individuals are playing this computer game, they have access to these resources, they can combine these resources in this workshop and try to make new tools. Once they get a new tool, they can put it in their stockpile and use it to make further combinations, and it's all for the sake of building a sacred totem to appease the gods. Okay, and that's what they're doing in this task. Now what makes this a really good experimental paradigm is that it has a really clean mechanism for inheritance. Okay, so everybody has this component, but over here you have access to, first of all, you have access to your own record of innovations. So every tool that you discover, you can access how to recreate that tool. but you can also have access to the innovation records of other individuals in the task. So that's how you sort of can inherit from other people the tools that they discovered. So you don't inherit the tools, you inherit the recipes that were used to create those tools. Then you can use that information. So here's a depiction of the sort of solution landscape. So again, individuals started with these 6 tools at the top, and they create these tools and they sort of increase in complexity. This is just a sample of the solution landscape, but once they get to this axe, that's when they can make the first totem pole. And over here, I'm just showing you some of the recipes. So this is what people in the diachronic condition would learn from. They start off by seeing how to make a set of these tools, and then the question is whether learning from all of these tools at the same time has an impact on future problem-solving performance. So does inheriting these tools at the beginning of the problem-solving task, how does that impact your ability to discover new tools? Okay, so in this experiment, participants played the totem game for 25 minutes. They were randomly assigned to generations 1 through 4. I had 42 complete chains. And participants assigned to generations 2 through 4 started off with the innovation record of the person who came before them. The outcome measures, I'm interested in the number of tools they created, their rate of new tool discovery, and the number of guesses that were required to make each of the tools. And my research questions were, how likely were participants able to exceed their ancestors? And this more interesting question, how does inheritance have an impact on new tool discovery? Okay, so here each one of these lines is a particular chain, and you see that performance tends to increase over generations. Now what's interesting here is the statistical model has a significant quadratic fit, which means that the benefit across generations decreases. So that the difference between 3rd and 4th generations is smaller than the difference between 1st and 2nd generations. So this might indicate that inheritance has a negative impact on problem solving. You're slowed down as you sort of go on. Now keep that in the back of your mind. I'm going to keep coming back to that. I'm just going to look at the same data a different way. This is based on the idea that a 2nd generation participant who inherits 10 tools is the same as a 4th generation participant who inherits those same tools. So we can instead look at performance relative to the number of tools that you inherited. So this dashed line would indicate that you just recreated the tools that you inherited and were not able to extend any farther. On the right here, I'm just showing the same reference line tilted horizontally. You see that overall participants do create more tools than their ancestors, but it seems again that if you inherit more tools, you have a harder time exceeding them. So again, we have this question, is this indicating that it becomes more costly, that there's a cost to accumulating these tools? Well, one thing that analysis ignores is the fact that there's really 2 parts of this experiment. The first part is spent recreating the tools that you inherit, and the second part is spent discovering new tools. So this analysis is going to take into account the time that you spent learning or recreating those tools and look just at your rate of new tool discovery. So here you see that there's a correlation here between the number of tools you inherit and the time it takes you to create them. That sort of makes sense. But if you sort of control for this learning time, you see that the rate of new tool discovery does not depend on the number of tools that you inherit. The slope of this line does not vary based on the number of tools that you inherit, which means that these later generations are not necessarily any less effective at solving new problems, but they just have less time because they spent more of the session recreating their old tools. The final analysis, I just want to look at a per tool analysis of how many guesses it took to create each tool. So for this analysis, for each tool, I sort of counted the number of guesses it took to discover that one. And to do this, I started counting at the point at which you had discovered all of the constituent parts for a particular tool. So once a tool was eligible for discovery, how many guesses did it take you until you discovered that? And I'm separating the analysis here, the generation 1 participants who did not inherit from a previous generation, and generations 2 through 4 who started off the problem-solving task with some of the solutions already filled in. And I'm splitting the analysis here based on whether you're recreating a tool that your ancestor had already discovered versus discovering a new tool. So here we see that this is the sort of expected effect of inheritance. That when you inherit a recipe for a tool, you're much faster to recreate that tool. This is the head start that each future generation gets on problem solving. But if you look at how their ability to discover new tools is affected, we don't see any difference here. That people in the later generations are just as able to discover tools as people in the first generation. Okay, so to summarize this first experiment, how likely were participants able to exceed their ancestors? Well, we see that participants were able to solve more problems in 25 minutes than their ancestors. This is just demonstrating that this is an experimental model of this cumulative cultural phenomena. Does inheritance have an impact on tool discovery? Nothing really here to talk about. There's no effect on the rate of new tool discovery, no effect on the number of guesses required for new tools. But the main limitation here, this is a sort of setup for building in these other strategies, because I really want to know how diachronic collaboration compares to alternative strategies for solving the same set of problems. So here were all the other conditions that I ran, and I'll talk about these in smaller groups here. But we have the diachronic group, of course, and then we have isolated strategies. We have a single person given 50 minutes, and then we also had, in a different condition, individuals come back for 4 subsequent sessions, and we can compare that as well. And for the synchronic group, we can compare a 2-person group to a 4-person group. Our research questions here: how does the effectiveness of diachronic collaboration compare to these alternatives? Does inheritance have an impact on new tool discovery relative to these alternatives? In the first experiment, I'm looking at the simplest form of diachronic inheritance, so that's just a 2-person team compared to an isolated individual given 50 minutes and a synchronic team of 2 people. And we see that the second generation diachronic collaborators spend their first time sort of rapidly getting up to the point that their ancestors left off, and then the question is, how do they do after that? And they sort of pattern out in the middle here. So marginal differences between these 2 groups and between these 2 groups, the diachronic and synchronic and the isolated 50. So it appears that diachronic collaboration is approximately equivalent, at least in 50 labor minutes in this particular task. You can look at that same guesses per tool analysis again. We find the same evidence that this is the benefit of inheritance, but we don't find that it results in a difference of discovering new tools. So performance is relatively constant here. Now the next analysis, I'm going to look at the guessing strategy that the participants took in this game. So in the previous analyses, I'm treating all the guesses that they made as being equivalent, but really each guess that a participant makes can be categorized in one of 4 types. You have a redundant guess that you've made before that doesn't create a new item. So this is a sign of guessing inefficiency. This would be an inefficient strategy, because if you're making redundant guesses, that isn't giving you any new information. Repeat items are just creating something that you've created before. A unique guess is the sort of optimal strategy. If you're performing this task optimally, you would just be making unique guesses, and you wouldn't be making any redundant guesses. And then a unique item is, of course, when you make a unique guess, that results in a new item. So we can look at the proportion of guesses in each of these 4 types and use that as our measure of guessing strategy. Here again, we've got first generation diachronic and second generation diachronic. And the biggest difference I want to focus on here is the proportion of redundant guesses in the second generation diachronic players relative to the isolated 50 players. So isolated players given 50 minutes are generating a much larger proportion of redundant guesses than their ancestors. Okay, now this indicates that their previous learning experience is slowing them down, because they're keep going back to previous guesses that they've made that don't reveal any new information about the problem space. So in this first experiment, simple diachronic inheritance is comparable to these alternative strategies for allocating 50 labor minutes. Does it have an impact on new tool discovery? No effect on the number of guesses required for new tools, but we've got some suggestive evidence that it may promote a less redundant guessing strategy than at least these isolated learners. Now the limitation here is the inefficiency of these isolated participants just related to the length of that session, the fact that they were in there for 50 minutes and everybody else had 25 minutes. So in the next experiment, we can compare these 2 directly. We could say, is it better to go it alone or pass off to somebody else? Now overall, we see that the isolated strategy wins in the end, that after 4 sessions, an individual learner tends to accumulate more tools than the diachronic strategy. So now we can ask why. What are they doing that's leading them to be more effective? The interesting thing is that if you look at their guessing strategies, there are no differences between the proportion of guesses in any of these categories from diachronic and isolated strategies. So how then are they able to exceed the performance of the diachronic players? It turns out that the reason is related to how quickly they recreate the tools that came before them. So here at the top, I'm showing the learning times that I showed earlier. So we saw that learning times sort of increased linearly in the diachronic collaboration, meaning that later generations, they take more time to recreate a larger set of tools. But for people coming back for multiple sessions, they're able to recreate the number of tools that they had in the previous session, regardless of the size of that inheritance. So it's flat here. They're very quickly able to recreate those tools. So their guessing strategy isn't any different. They just have more time to solve new problems. But what's really interesting is if you look at the point at which they have recreated their tools that they had in the last session or that their ancestor had, and how many guesses does it take to discover a new tool, okay? So this is the cost of first discovery. And you see that across diachronic participants, it's flat. So even though these participants are inheriting more tools, they're just as likely, or they're just as able to discover the first new tool, extending their ancestor in the second generation as in the fourth generation. But in the isolated participants coming back from multiple sessions, they have this increasing cost of the first discovery. This indicates that these individuals are becoming fixated on wherever they were in the previous session. They get back to where they were, and they're unable to sort of get out of that rut. So even though this doesn't result in an overall improvement in performance, it does suggest that one of the big differences between a diachronic strategy and an isolated strategy might be related to this idea of fixation. So is it better to go it alone or pass off to someone else? Isolated participants, they discovered more tools, but they did not guess any more effectively. They weren't generating more unique guesses and less redundant guesses than in these other strategies. But we have some evidence that diachronic collaboration may be useful in remediating the costs of fixation. Okay, for the last experiment, I want to investigate the impact of adding 2 people to either a diachronic or a synchronic team. This is going to be used as a way to measure whether these strategies are equally scalable as you sort of add more people to them. So in a 2-person team, we remember that the synchronic team was slightly more effective than the diachronic strategy. But what's interesting is that if you add 2 people to a synchronic team from 2 to 4, you don't observe an improvement in performance. So you're just as well solving this task in a 2-person synchronic team as you are in a 4-person synchronic team. But if you add 2 people to a diachronic team, you do see this improvement in performance. So again, these main effects are not significant. The interaction is reliable. It's suggestive evidence that diachronic and synchronic collaboration may differ in this idea of scalability as you add more people. So to summarize the results from this totems game, diachronic collaborators are able to exceed their ancestors in this task. This means that this is a good experimental model for investigating questions about cumulative culture. Simple diachronic collaboration, just that 2-person team, is comparable to these alternatives. Even though they have to recreate the tools that came before them, they seem to result in similar overall performance. And we have some evidence that diachronic collaboration may reduce the cost of fixation that slows down individual learners, and some evidence that diachronic collaboration may be more scalable, potentially, than synchronic collaboration. Now, the issue with this is that it doesn't allow us to investigate skill diversity, because there's no way that the solution space is relatively constrained in that there's only a few ways you can get through the solution space, and so there's no way in which you can sort of start off with a solution that you could not have, you would have been totally different from somebody else. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on this last experiment here. So here we're just focusing on the idea of complementary inheritance. So can generations trained on independent skills exceed the performance of individuals working alone? So for this experiment, I'm thinking about problem solving in a more continuous space. So here you can think about solutions to problems as varying in continuous dimensions, and each solution would be a point in this plane, and the height of the landscape at that point corresponds to the quality of the solution. So this comes out of evolutionary theory. Sewall Wright came up with this idea of an adaptive landscape as being a model for understanding how evolution proceeds. So in his models, individuals could vary in certain traits, and populations were sort of viewed as a cloud of points on this landscape. And as they reproduced, they sort of moved about the landscape, trying to find the peaks of this particular landscape, corresponding to the highest fitness. So in a problem-solving case, points on this landscape are individual solutions, and you're trying to find the peaks corresponding to the best solutions. And I'm going to look at this in two cases. So first, I'm just going to use an agent-based model to illustrate this idea of complementary inheritance. And then I'm going to perform a behavioral test of this basic idea. Okay, so in the agent-based model, this is a computational model. Individuals are assigned skill corresponding to vision in either dimension. So here you have people with equal skill in either vision, vision X or vision Y. And here you have unequal skill. So someone is biased in their vision for Y compared to X. These vision values correspond to a search area in that landscape. So here it doesn't look square, but there should be a square here. So they can sort of search equally in all directions, compared to when you have unequal skill, they're sort of biased to search along a particular dimension. And then what I did was combine these agents into teams. So you have a team of congruent individuals that are each trained on the same skills relative to a complementary group. So they're sort of trained on equal but opposite skills. So if you run these simulations, you have these agents sort of do a random walk trying to find the peak of this landscape. So they start in this corner, they search around their area, they find a point that they can move to a higher elevation of the landscape, and they do that for 100 trials. Now here what you see is that an individual with unequal skills at the halfway point is worse off than someone with equal skills. Okay, so that means that you're trained on equal skills. If you just sort of look at individual performance, having an unequal skill is the worst strategy here. But when you pass that off to the next generation, you see that having complementary skills leads to this interaction where they're sort of propelled to be back in first place. They result in better overall performance. So why is that? How can that happen in this particular case? Now the reason is this grid is just showing the actual grid positions here. So individuals start here, and this is the congruent team, or the congruent team, and here is the complementary team. And you see that people with equal skills just sort of proceed linearly toward the target. But as you increase in skill diversity, you see that these individuals with complementary skills proceed to a part of the solution landscape that this individual would not have been able to reach on their own. So they're starting off in a unique part of the position or the solution landscape, and they're better positioned to reach that target. So this is this idea of complementary inheritance, that inheriting from someone who puts you in a part of the solution landscape that you wouldn't have been able to reach by yourself might, in some cases, result in better overall performance than either individual alone. So this is sort of a toy model just illustrating this idea, but we can use a behavioral experiment to sort of flesh this out. So in the experiment, they are doing this perceptual judgment task using these Gabor patches here. What's interesting about these Gabor patches is that I can vary them in two continuous dimensions. I can vary their orientation, and I can vary their spatial frequency, or what I'll refer to as bar width, just referring to that. So we have a continuous landscape of these stimuli, and participants are trained on complementary skills in the sense that they can either be trained to pay attention to the orientation of those Gabor patches, or they can be trained to pay attention to the bar width. And here are the experimental conditions. So participants were assigned to pay attention to either orientation or bar width, and they were assigned to either first or second generation. So first generation participants just sort of proceed all by themselves. And then what I did is for the second generation participants, I took the point where they were at halfway through the experiment and used that as the starting point for either someone trained on the same skills or the starting point for someone trained on complementary skills. Okay, so now we can say, from this point, is it better to continue by myself, pass off to somebody with the same skills as me, or pass off to someone with complementary skills? Here's what the game actually looked like. So we told people that these Gabor patches were precious gems on a foreign planet, and they had to detect which gems were more valuable than others. So the value was corresponding to the height on that landscape. And they start off in the corner here, and they have a sort of vision radius all the way around them, and they sort of proceed as they select gems on each trial. They're proceeding through this landscape, trying to get to the peak. In order to sort of induce people to pay attention to either orientation or bar width, we use these block of training trials with a bias. So for the training trials, if you're assigned to orientation, you complete some trials where the value of the gems is determined entirely by orientation. If you're in the bar width condition, you complete some trials where the value of the gems is determined entirely by bar width. So this is training you to pay attention to either dimension. And then the interesting part was this test landscape, which was a simple hill, which was symmetric with regard to the two dimensions. Participants were assigned to generation and instruction condition. We had 64 participants, and twice as many in the second generation as in the first generation, because each first generation was the starting point for 2 second generation players. There's 30 guesses on the training landscape, and then they did 4 blocks of 40 guesses on that test landscape. There's 2 outcome measures I'll talk about. The first is sort of trial by trial sensitivity. So given that display of 6 gems that was on each trial, how do the dimensions of the stimuli predict your ability to select that stimuli? So are you sensitive to orientation when you're making your selection, or are you sensitive to bar width? The other outcome measure is just the overall grid position. So how close did you get to the peak of the landscape? Okay, so in the training trials, you see that this is just sort of validating that the training worked, because everybody starts in the same point of this landscape, but if you're trained on bar width, you proceed toward the peak bar width value, and if you're trained on orientation, you proceed toward the peak orientation. So I can sort of collapse these symmetrically collapse these, and you see that they proceed closer to the one-dimensional peak, depending on their training condition. Now, the difference between these lines is unintentional. It suggests that the orientation was harder for people to discern in the experiment than the bar width. So this was something that in future work we could calibrate that a little more carefully, but we can control for that in all the analyses. So we have a distance measure, so how close did you get to the peak in this one dimension? And we also have the score, which is very related. That's just the height of that landscape. Okay, so here's sensitivity in the training trials. So each of these lines is a particular individual, and positive sensitivity values means that on each trial you selected gems that were better along that particular dimension. So if you are sensitive to orientation, you tend to select gems that move you in the stimulus space closer to the best value along that dimension. And here you have sensitivity to bar width, meaning that you're choosing your gems on each trial corresponding to the bar width of the gem. And you see that if you collapse those again, you see that people are much more sensitive to their trained dimension than their untrained dimension. Again, this is just illustrating that the training actually worked in inducing people to pay attention to different aspects of the same stimuli. Okay, so now we can test this question of what happens in the test trials. Okay, so here, if you just look at position, you have the first generation individuals who sort of proceed based on their training condition for 20 trials. And then at that point, you start off people in the congruent or the complementary condition. And you see that the orange and green lines are overlapping, indicating that continuing on is the same as passing on to someone who is trained on the same skills as you. But if you pass off to someone with complementary skills, you sort of see this divergence. And in particular, the divergence leads you to getting closer to the two-dimensional peak, and it leads you to having a better score. So this is illustrating this idea that starting off in a part of the solution landscape that you would have been unable to reach by yourself results in better overall performance than an individual working alone or someone with congruent skills. But the really interesting finding about this experiment is looking at these sensitivities. So you could have those previous results even if people were equally sensitive to their trained dimension. Just as in the agent-based models, they weren't changing their performance as a result of where they started, but they were still able to sort of position themselves better overall. But here we see that the complementary individuals became more sensitive to their trained dimension than the participants in these other conditions. So that suggests that by starting off in a unique part of this problem space, they're being exposed to variability among these gems that they wouldn't have seen otherwise, and that actually causes them to become more sensitive to their trained dimension. So it actually changes their future performance just by starting off in a different part of the solution landscape. So that's sort of suggestive evidence that diachronic collaboration might have influences on future problem-solving performance. So this experiment just demonstrating this idea of complementary inheritance using both an agent-based model and a behavioral experiment. And the most interesting thing, the thing I want to explore the most, is that starting in a unique part of this problem space may actually have an influence on future performance. Okay, so I started with this question of when is a relay strategy effective for problem solving? I had two hypotheses here. I can summarize my results. The first hypothesis was that inheritance may remediate the cost of fixation. So we found that second generation diachronic participants were less redundant in their guessing strategy than isolated individuals giving 50 minutes. And we found that diachronic participants had an easier time making a first new discovery beyond what they inherited than isolated individuals. The second hypothesis related to complementary inheritance, the idea that passing solutions on to the second generation may help when those two generations have complementary skills for some types of problems. The limitations of this work, there was no social interaction in any of the experiments here. Now, this allows me to very tightly regulate the information that's being conveyed in what's being inherited, but this doesn't correspond to a lot of real-world tasks. So there's a lot of room to explore the impact of social interaction, allowing people to summarize what they learned and teach it to the next generation. These are all sort of closed-ended problem-solving tasks, but it would be much more interesting in terms of answering questions about cumulative culture as a whole to have experimental models that are more open-ended. And there's also just this idea that diachronic and synchronic, I've sort of teased them apart here, but combining them in various ways might reveal unique behaviors as well. Future generations, I can talk about the data that I wished I would have had today. Looking at overlapping generations in the totems game, again, allowing people to sort of summarize what they learned for future generations. Another future direction would be to use data from the isolated individuals across multiple sessions as starting points for diachronic individuals. So we compare side by side how someone coming back for the second session does compared to a diachronic person starting at that exact point. And the other idea would be to more experimentally manipulate fixation. So fixation was a sort of property of the totem game, but there's better experimental models for fixation. So I could be a little more, I could control that a little more carefully. Okay, so what does this mean for cultural evolution? Well, this supports theories in cultural evolution that argue for the adaptiveness of cultural inheritance. But what I really wanted to do was challenge the assumption that cultural inheritance is only adaptive because individual lives are limited. I wanted to explore the idea that cultural inheritance may confer benefits to future generations that is not just having a longer lifetime. In this last part, the most sort of speculative idea here is that diachronic collaboration may provide a mechanism for the acceleration of technological complexity in modern culture. So if we can understand how cultural inheritance improves the performance of future generations, we can start to build a case for why it's helpful, or why humans have sort of exploded in technological complexity. Right, so I started with this question of how can we measure the impact of inheritance on problem solving, and this is what I sort of came up with. This is my lens now that I can view the world, and I want to investigate this more thoroughly. And I'm really interested in what does it mean to be good at diachronic collaboration? Out in the real world, what are instances of this, and can we sort of investigate, using this lens, can we have a better understanding of things that are out there in the world? And the two cases that I'm most excited about, the first, the thing I've been thinking about for a lot, is the Wikipedia editing strategy. This is an instance of diachronic collaboration in the wild, that these articles are passed from editor to editor, but we don't really have a good way of understanding how effective that form of problem solving is, or article writing in this particular case. And there's also a lot of this, you can investigate these phenomena in open source software development. So there you have very clean mechanism of inheritance, and investigating how the starting point at solving problems is influencing your future problem-solving performance in the context of software development is really interesting as well. All right, and now I'll take your questions. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
This is really cool. I have one question. You talked a little bit about how this might be a way of getting people away from these fixation points about certain strategies. But I was wondering about how noise gets passed through this system. So there's sort of two parts. Just you talked a little bit about it in this last experiment about how being exposed to different
So in terms of the latter case, there's a paper that's illustrating that exact phenomena. Boyd and Richardson have argued that a lot of this stuff is non-conscious or unconscious. So they look at food taboos among pregnant women in Fijian villages, and they find that these villagers have certain sort of taboos about what species of fish to eat, and they sort of charted that those taboos correspond to levels of toxins in the local fish populations, but without explicit causal information. So they want to argue that you don't need to be, copying doesn't need to be a full causal understanding to have sort of cumulative benefits. To get to your first question, the basic idea that learning from someone else or learning from previous solutions might sort of help you infer future behaviors is the idea that by learning, so in the totem game, by learning about a bunch of those recipes at the same time, you might get a better sense of the problem landscape as a whole. So how was this task designed? People don't know right away that if they can combine two items at the same time, or if all the combinations need to be unique. So there might be a sort of insight that is spurred to future generations when they are allowed to sort of see all of the information at once, sort of passed on. There's also the idea that people might be able to selectively pass on only the beneficial information that they sort of filter for you and passing on as well. So that's another factor that may go into that. Mm-hmm.
Kind of going off what you just said about like selecting what information gets passed on in cultural evolution and biological evolution, one of the advantages is also like kind of the natural selection that happens. Like unsuccessful people in prior generations don't ever become teachers, and also as a learner you can kind of look for cues as to who's a good teacher and kind of pay more attention to them than others. Have you like thought about building either of those forms of selection into your studies?
Yeah. So. The picking who to learn from is an area of active debate, is generally referred to as social learning strategy. So how do you figure out who's going to be my good model in these experiments? By terming what I'm looking at here as diachronic collaboration, I'm trying to focus on just the cases where you're trying to sort of benefit other people. But there are people that argue that you can't study cultural evolution through this sort of one generational change because of this idea of filtering, that we need to have a better awareness of who we're copying in order for it to be beneficial. So acknowledging that is an area of other research, I'm just trying to focus on the most beneficial cases where you're both trying to solve the same thing. There's no sort of maladaptive things that are getting creeped in. But the idea of if people can sort of unintentionally prevent you from solving future problems is worth considering, and depends on the experiment that we have. Mm-hmm.
I wrote something, I'm going to argue. So it seems like one theme that you have through this is that you said this sort of at the beginning, that there is more of this progression, this gradual accumulation of tools and knowledge, and that punctuated periods of rare genes is not as important as it might seem. But in your example of Gutenberg, it seems like what you're missing is that there is a critical thing. It might be tools that were available since Roman times, but there's an insight and a generalization to a new domain that makes it really powerful. And so, for example, if you had something in your totem setup, which is really, really great, but say, for example, you had a few individuals who wanted to take their bearings and combine it. If you allowed for that, I suspect most people wouldn't even try that. But if that unlocked a whole new problem space, do you think that would have a overall net gain? That you'd have some people who would say, what if I try this really crazy idea and I put berries with rocks and see what happens there? If they have this ability to unlock a completely new domain, it seems like that would benefit everybody because you have these few little bits of insight that are being infused into the system.
Yeah, so the way that's been studied is to look at network structure. So basically finding that when you have a group of people that's a fully connected network, everybody sort of copies everybody else, and they sort of converge on whatever solution is the best at the time. But if you have a partially connected network where people are not exposed to everybody at the same time, you might sort of be able to explore more widely. So that's the way that it's been done in the past, is having sort of these synchronic groups and varying the network structure. And yeah, you do have people argue for this exact thing, that in some cases all the information isn't necessarily helpful, and it's better to give this benefit to partial connectivity because it allows for exploring different parts. So I agree to that. Yeah. Mark?
It seems it would be interesting to look at in the totem experiment, not necessarily the solutions that are found, but the attempts that are made as a consequence of what's inherited. And this is kind of building up, I'm not sure if this is exactly what Emily's getting at, but it was sort of inspired by her observations. If you imagine, person one doing, really maximizing a certain function, much like your second experiment, but failing to see some other function that they could have maximized, but maybe accidentally discovering one thing, then that's inherited, and person two sees, oh, you can do this other thing. Well, let me just test out all the, combining various twice or something like that. Let me just combine everything twice and see what works. It turns out you only get one yield out of that. But are they going in new directions, much like your second, the Gabor patches illustrates, where different strategies are being tested, not necessarily yielding anything, but as a consequence of what's being inherited.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think, I don't have the data to illustrate that just because I wasn't manipulating the solution landscape, but you can imagine building in some of these features that may be more productive later on. If you sort of pick up on this early feature, does that explore things later on? There is an experiment that the same guy, Max Derricks, did, where people combine potions, and there the solution landscape was constructed in a way that early on you sort of diverge in the solution landscape, and sort of people take different trajectories, and then what he did was have people sort of simulate moving around, and they sort of join a different population. And so if you're exposed then to people who took a different path, then you're able to go through and recreate all of those intermediate steps. So that is definitely, again, it goes into this idea of partial connectivity potentially being beneficial in some cases. Yeah. Yep.
Another thought that I had that sort of related, I think, to this idea of not two chain, but sort of more to your diachronic lens. I was kind of thinking about, for instance, the fact in this sort of game that, what you can see from previous generations is like the output, like the tools that they create.
Uh-huh.
Other things might be helpful too, like what paths don't work or something like that. Like what, and in general, it sort of made me think about, whether it would matter or how much of a boost you might get if, rather than, having the inputs to the next sort of person up in the diachronic chain, be just like the output of what somebody created, let that previous person kind of have some sort of control over what gets passed along to the next person in the chain.
Yeah.
You could imagine just like, them filtering some of the tools that get passed on, or like passing along a strategy not to use or something like that, or
Yeah.
in general kind of like, how you think